All right. We are going to get started again for part two in just a moment here. We've had an opportunity for some social time. So, those folks who were on Zoom got to go into breakout rooms and chat with each other. I attempted to organize the breakout rooms according to topics, and that failed. And I own that. It's a technology learning curve for me. My hope is that folks had a great time connecting with each other in the breakout rooms. If you are with us on Zoom, please feel free to pop into the chat what your experience was like. We are going to get started here again in just a moment, but since we started up the live stream again, I should restart the recording again. So as we get started here again, I'm just going to refresh the safer spaces policy. So this policy is based on what I use with my own online workshops, and it's really to help curate a space where we can come together as community in a positive way. So when we meet online, there is never a guarantee of confidentiality. So please do exercise your personal boundaries and discretions with what you share. As admin, I maintain control over video and audio to ensure a smooth flow and to avoid interruptions. These sessions are being recorded and will be edited for later viewing. And as we just had, sections for participant interaction will not be recorded, and we'll have another opportunity for that in a couple of hours. Racism, misogyny, ableism, ageism, transphobia, and other forms of discrimination are not conducive to a positive community environment, and so they will not be tolerated here. And any anti-science rhetoric, conspiracy theories, COVID-19 denialism, anti-masking, QAnon, and related alt-right and fascist ideologies are harmful, and support or perpetuation of them will result in being removed from the event. So if you're just joining us, welcome. My name is Mel. I use they, them pronouns. I am a queer, solo polyamorous relationship anarchist. I'm one of the co-founders of the Solo Polyamory Facebook group, and I'm here celebrating Solo Polyamory Day. I live on the unceded territories of the Comox Nation on so-called Vancouver Island, and these are the traditional territories of the Comox, Pentlak, Homalco, Wewei-Kai, Wewei-Kum, and Tla'amin peoples. And it is a great privilege to be here as a visitor on these lands and to have a stable life here. My ancestors, I come from a matrilineal line who have been refugees and survivors of ethnic cleansings and genocides and so forth. And I feel that privilege every day. And I'm grateful for my ancestors for giving me the resilience to get to where I am. Reading some of the conversation in the chat here. Thank you. I'm having a blast here today. It's great. Thanks, Roz. Nancy has shared a link to the presentation that she just did before our little social break. And we'll have that recording up as well. Roz says in the breakout rooms, they shared a bit about personal stories, and it was nice to meet and learn about folks. That's awesome. You know, I wanted to make sure that there was that opportunity to do that and try to find the right balance for how to organize this day. You know, I put the question out to the solo polyamory community on the Facebook group and was like, do I put this on Facebook? Do I put this on YouTube? How do we navigate that confidentiality piece? And so my hope is that there is during the day that opportunity to connect with community, to learn, to enrich your experience. And I will send everybody who's participated in the Zoom a feedback form later on. So moving right ahead, we're going to jump into our next session. And thank you, Gisetta. So for those of you who are on Zoom, you can rename yourself. I'm only using first names if I refer to you in the comments. If you'd rather I not use your name, you can change it. You can call yourself Darth Vader. That's fine. I'll just use whatever you tell me you are named. And I'm really excited to welcome on our next speaker. So Allie, I am going to add you here as a pinned speaker, and I'm going to invite you to unmute. And So, Ali Hendry is a wonderful, wonderful human being. If you're not familiar with her work, she's going to tell you a little bit more about it. But I first encountered Ali through I think it was through the Trauma Super Conference or the Relationship Super Conference. Jai was here earlier today, so you may have heard us mention that there. And Ali brings a wealth of information and has done a lot of work around jealousy, one of those hot topics that we come up with in polyamory. And I'm really stoked to have her here today. What time is it for you right now, Ali?
It's 8 p.m.
Okay,
in
not too
yeah,
unreasonable.
it's not actually. Yeah, it's been a lovely day. Those of you who've still got a day to come, I can confirm. Going to be a lovely day for you.
We've had so many folks joining from the UK today that I'm like, is that just my own bias of someone who was born in the UK that like I've just connected with all these SOPO people in the UK?
You've manifested us. You've literally manifested us.
We'll see. I don't
Yeah.
know. Ali, do you want me to make you co-host? Do you have slides to share?
I haven't got slides.
Okay. Would
Yes,
it be
but
helpful
I
for
don't.
you to be co-host?
Sure thing. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. If you want to, yeah, that'd be
All
fine.
right.
Thank you.
I will make you co-host there. That'll just give you, if you do want to invite some interaction from folks, it'll give you the ability to unmute them. Um, and yeah, I'm gonna hand it over to you to introduce yourself. I'll still be here in the background. I'm just gonna take a little bit more of a self-care break for myself. And yeah, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for creating such a beautiful environment. Can we get on those reactions tabs and send out love to Mel for everything that they have done for us today? Thank you so much. So here's my links. I'll put them in. I'm a certified holistic relationship coach. I work with individuals, couples, groups, and non-monogamy pods. I'm the UK Education Director for Radiant Coaches Academy, who are actually based in America. And I teach students on a certified holistic life coach course and my own certified relationship coaching course, which started this year. And we are now already on cohort 3, which launches next month. I write the relationship column for Diva magazine, which is an LGBT, women, non-binary, trans magazine. And I run a relationship room at Diva magazine Instagram, which Mel has been on, and I'll be mentioning a few other people who have also come on and talked about relationships. So if you are an Instagram person, have a look on Diva magazine's profile and you can have a look at the past recordings under their reels. So I'm going to talk about prioritizing friendships and community. I also wanted to talk a little bit about my journey into non-monogamy as well. And if you've got any comments or questions, then do put them into the chat and I will try and keep an eye on the chat as we go through. One of the things that I did before I became a coach for the last 20 years or so was inclusion consultant and trainer. So I do like to bring in a lot of equality, diversity and inclusion into presentations as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that later on. I was interested in the vote actually in terms of how long people have been solo polyamorous. And yeah, for me, it's been a year and a half, so not that long. I came into non-monogamy 8 years ago. Before that, I was a serial monogamist, which I think is a type of non-monogamy, actually, serial monogamy, because if I look back at my relationships, quite often there was an overlap, not just a sexual overlap, but actually sometimes there was a romantic overlap or an emotional overlap with individuals where I hadn't, although by all intents and purposes, I was with a new person, I was still attached in some way to the previous person. So I like to have a think about actually where is non-monogamy showing up in monogamous ways. I also think that the way that people date nowadays, monogamous people date, is non-monogamous. I do. So I think it's interesting how we like to think in binary terms. It's either this or it's that, and actually there is a lot more context, minutiae, exploration, subtleties around some of this. So Yeah, so I'd just come out of a very, very long, epic saga, beautiful relationship 8 years ago, and I was dating, non-monogamous dating, interacting with lots of different people in different ways. And then I entered a V. So I had a girlfriend. I also had occasional sex with other people, but I had a main girlfriend, and my girlfriend was married to her wife. So there was a V situation. Those of you who aren't familiar with a V, if you imagine the shape of a V, you've got two people at the top and one person at the bottom. So on each end, if you like, you've got a person, so three people. And you've got the person in the bottom, it's called the hinge, and they have got a relationship with this person and they've got a relationship with that person. But those two people at the top don't have a sexual or romantic relationship. They're called metamors. So I entered a V, and that worked for a few years. Well, I say worked. It was a work in progress, as many of us may have experienced as we entered non-monogamy. So we kind of muddled through. We read all the books. I'm a big advocate of book reading. Hashtag Ali's Book Club is a real hashtag. Hashtag Ali's Book Club. There are a lot of general non-monogamy books. The one that I like the best is actually this one, Opening Up. So if you are looking at all the books, I like this one, A Guide to Creating and Sustaining Open Relationships. If you are more of a journal type person, there are lots of lovely journals. These are just my personal favorites. I love this one. It was out last year. This is my favorite journal. It's called the Polyamory Journal, a relationship book, prompts and practices for navigating non-monogamy, by Kate Kincaid. I really like that one. It's a good one. And this one as well, as while we're talking about books, The Relationship Escalator. Some of you might be familiar with this one. It's a really great book. Stepping Off the Relationship Escalator, Uncommon Love and Life by Amy Garan. And it really gives you an idea of so many different types of relationships. So yeah, we were in the V, and then I started dating her wife. So we became a throuple. And that worked for a while until it didn't work. And if you do want more information about that, then you can have a look at Survivor's Guide to Jealousy, which is the TED Talk that I was lucky enough to do last year. Interestingly, my journey with jealousy was actually facilitated by going into non-monogamy. So yeah, have a look at Survivor's Guide to Jealousy if jealousy is part of your skill set as well, and let me know what you think. It's interesting that I say 8 years ago I entered non-monogamy, because actually it was when I was 16, if truth be known, because I was at 16. I had a boyfriend, a holiday love, and I also had my second boyfriend on the same holiday at the same time. So I had two boyfriends at the same time, and we all knew about each other and we were all fine with it. 2 week family holiday. But it's interesting when I look back at how natural that seemed. It seemed they were both very, very different. One was a boy, one was a man, age-wise. And we all kind of got on really well, and it was absolutely fine. And we'd hang out together and independently. Yes, it was only 2 weeks. Yes, I was 16. But it is really interesting that it felt so natural. Anyway, after that, I sleepwalked my way through monogamy. I think a lot of us do, and had some very lovely relationships. As I said, serial monogamy, epic sagas, from one epic saga to another, and then moved into the non-monogamy side of things. After the throuple, I then moved into open relationships where we were dating, where I had a primary. And we didn't really use primary, although, of course, it was primary, it was hierarchical. We had a primary relationship, and then both of us in those different relationships, we would date independently. So I moved into solo polyamory about a year and a half ago. I started to hear about it. I joined the fantastic solo polyamory Facebook group. You've got 13,000 voices in there, really valuable resource. Started doing a lot of reading, following people, following the hashtags, and just finding out about solo polyamory. And it just absolutely fit where I was at. I felt like I had had a very good run of long-term monogamous relationships. I'd had a good run of whatever long-term means. I mean, the relationship escalator obviously says, why do we equate length of service with how intense that relationship is? And I agree. And obviously it's so indoctrinated in me, but significant relationships of different lengths. And so moving into solo polyamory, for me, that looks like centering myself and looking at my own capacities, my own time, my own energy, my own attention. Where do I put those things? Time, energy, and attention. How do they fit into not just my romantic relationships, but also my friendships, my family, my work life? And talking of books, because I do love a book. If you haven't read this was out this year. It's a fantastic, fantastic book. This is Why It's Okay to Not Be Monogamous. Why It's Okay to Not Be Monogamous by Justin L. Clardy, who is a philosopher and researcher. I don't read many philosophy books by philosophers, and it was just so illuminating. It really, really spoke to me. And he talks about time, T. He calls it T, hence the picture, T. He talks about time, energy, and attention. And it just started to make so much sense to me as I moved into my 50s and was thinking about what are my priorities and what things are important to me and what do I need right now. So really interesting to have a think about how you share your resources and how others share their resources with you, because one of the things that I talk about a lot as a coach is when you enter any kind of relationship, whether it's monogamous or non-monogamous, there is the you, there is the other person, and there is the relationship. So there are three entities. And of course, if there are other relationships as well, there's all of those, the you, the them, and the relationship. And those three things all need your input. They all need your support. They all need, you need to be looking at the time, the energy, and the attention that you can spend on those areas. I mean, it sounds like a lot, doesn't it? And I think it's important for us to keep checking in with ourselves. How am I feeling? How are my resources right now? Okay. What else do I want to talk about? I want to mention, I'm speeding through this. Let's see, have we got any questions? That one is so good. Oh, yeah, it is, isn't it? I love that. Oh, thank you for putting in the link to the group. That's fantastic. Yes, 13,000 people. Absolutely. It's just called Solo Polyamory. The group is. Yeah. Thank you for posting that in there. Okay. So let's move on to, yes, what it means to be polyamorous. I do a lot of work around boundaries with my clients. I talk a lot about boundaries and the way that I like to, you've probably seen a lot of work when it comes to non-monogamy and solo polyamory, thinking about boundaries. You know this word, it gets bandied around. I like a visual. So the way that I think of boundaries is me in the field with my fence around me. And my fence is my boundary. And I decide who comes in and who doesn't, because boundaries are set and maintained by ourselves. They are not enforced by anybody else. They belong to us. So you're in your field. That person who you're in a relationship with, they're in their field and they've got their fence and that's their boundary. And they're deciding on what's okay and what's not okay. So thinking about how you not only set, but also maintain boundaries, because sometimes we front load our boundary work. We spend a lot of time invest a lot of thoughts around how am I going to say this? What am I going to say? What am I going to do? And then we forget that we have to keep it going. And the other person, this is how I like to see boundaries. Expect a pushback, because likely you've been thinking about this for a while. And so when you tell them what your yeses are or your nos are, there's going to be an element of them going, wait a minute, where did the other person go? This is new. I'm not quite sure what's happening here. So they're going to be surprised. There's going to be a pushback. And this is where it needs to kick in around you maintaining your boundaries. So have a plan for, yes, of course, the right time, the right place, to the right level, giving the right amount of information when you're setting your boundaries, and also be ready for a pushback, expect it, and think about how you're going to maintain them, which is, often through those actions speaking louder than words. Another area that it really means that really has really come up for me, it's been interesting putting together this talk actually, has been around attraction. And this is something that I talk about on the Certified Relationship Coach training course with Radiant Coaches, different types of attraction. And I guess it ties into how I relate to different people in different ways and what is being activated, enhanced, stimulated in those different interactions. And this could be sexual, could be physical, romantic, emotional, intellectual, aesthetic, olfactory, spiritual. Could be any or all of the above. So when you think about past relationships and you think about what actually, which bit or bits was coming to the surface, what was important to me, how was our connection formed in the first instance? What is it? Where was the spark? Was it an emotional spark or an intellectual spark? Maybe it was a spiritual spark. And I think if we can go into these relationships with more consciousness and more awareness, then we can work out how we keep those things going. Because when we talk about being with someone for a while, we can get lazy, of course we can, and we can forget what originally floated our boat, what stoked us up. And how can we recreate? How can we recreate that environment with our connections? So, interestingly, that's the other thing, because I wanted to talk a little bit about community, the importance of community and friendships, and how that's come out more during my solo polyamory journey. I've been going through menopause for the last couple of years, and when I've had relationships, dates, sex with people who are also on their menopause journey, there's been this amazing depth of understanding and sharing of experiences. And that wasn't something I expected to come out of non-monogamy. So it's interesting how that sense of community that we do so well can enhance those areas of massive change that might be going on for you. So as I've entered this new season, to be able to have lovers who have had similar experiences or maybe different experiences, to be able to support each other, has been an amazingly powerful experience. So as we know, for non-monogamy, it is important for us to look at community, and we've got a lot of resources. What I find quite interesting is a lot of the non-monogamy resources, including me as a resource. I do a weekly talkinar. I call them. Is it a talk? Is it a webinar? No, it's a talkinar. I do a weekly talkinar in my coaching community group on Facebook. You are most welcome to join. I'll just pop all the links in there. A lot of the educators are white, and I think it's very interesting, myself included, it's very interesting that actually it was colonialism who worked very hard on obliterating non-monogamy by enforcing monogamy. And so I think we need to be really careful about what voices we are listening to and make sure that we get that wider picture. So here are a few that I love. I mean, you've got people invited onto this into this environment that you can follow. The people that I love following on Instagram, I enjoy decolonizing.love, Lavita Loca 34, Shanae Speaks, who's actually been into the relationship room as well. So if you go into the Diva magazine Instagram and have a look at the Reels tab, you can find my conversation. It was a couple of months ago now, by Gabrielle Smith. And then there's some, that's just a few people I wanted to mention. There's also some great podcasts. Queer Retrograde, I love. Hobbs and Linz are both solo polyamorous, so check out Queer Retrograde. Again, you can find, there's a chat again in Diva magazine in the Reels tab that I had with Queer Retrograde, and we were fanning all about our experiences of solo polyamory. So check that out if you're an Instagram person. Monogamish Pod is another great podcast by Jen. So since moving into solo polyamory in the last year and a half, I mean, some of this started during lockdown in terms of feeling more connected to my friends. It's certainly ramped up since I've been looking at kind of more of a flat management structure to my friendships, my relationships, my family. And I've got a friend who, for the last year and a half, so basically what I've been doing is establishing routines and rituals and routines with my friendships, which is a fantastic way of remembering to connect when you form rituals and routines. Esther Perel talks about rituals and routines. She talks about the difference and how to define the difference. And I love her description. She says routines are laying the table, something you do every day. Just lay the table. It's a routine. We do it routinely every day. We might lay the table. That might be what we do in our household. A ritual would be when we get out the special cutlery and the special napkins for a special event. So when we ritualize something, we make more meaning out of it. So a routine that I've got is with one of my friends is that we message each other every day. And we send two things that we send to each other. The first is I am grateful for, and the second is I deserve. And it's been so interesting doing that every day for the last year and a half and seeing how things have changed for us. And we're there and we support each other and we see each other and hear each other. So if that is resonating with you, think about who you could do that with, because we know the value of gratitude lists and affirmations and how we can call things to us by creating that environment around. I mean, I'm a holistic relationship coach, so I am all over that. Absolutely a big advocate of that. I've got another friend where we do weekly calls and holidays and emergency calls. Another friend who is the weekly calls and the holidays as well. And then another friend, I haven't got loads of friends, I'm not showing off. And then another friend where we do fortnightly meetups with our kids. So both our kids didn't grow up with siblings, so they call each other sisters. So we have a ritual. We do this ritualized meal, and we do a ritual holiday every year that always involves tents, camping. So if that's something that's part of your solo polyamory journey, I'd be really interested in how you hold yourself to your friendships. A couple of other things I wanted to talk about before we finish. One is attachment theory, because some of you may be familiar with attachment theory. You also might be familiar with Polysecure, which talks about attachment theory by Jessica Fern. Jessica Fern, again, another guest into the relationship room of Diva magazine, if you want to go rummaging there. Attachment theory. Now, this was in 1950s, 1960s London. John Bowlby, with a very nice moustache and matching eyebrows with the moustache, he was talking about how we form attachment. So as babies, our first experience of love, and I'm using this the sort of the shoulds, or the with full acceptance that we do not always have what we should have had as children. So attachment theory talks about how our first understanding of a relationship is from our carers, from our primary carers. And so as we enter adulthood, we can seek the same kind of experience, the same kind of relationship that we experienced as children. Now, what John Bowlby in 1960s London wasn't thinking about was Indigenous populations. So he did very much centre his work around Eurocentric nuclear families. So it is worth bearing that in mind. And he came up with either individuals who had a secure attachment or an insecure attachment. An insecure attachment has been divided into, I mean, there are lots of different types and more coming to the party. Other attachment styles are available. But essentially, there's the secure attachment, and then there's the insecure attachment, which is divided into other sections. So insecure attachment, I'll just talk about three. There's anxious, avoidant, and fearful avoidant, which is a combination of anxious and avoidant. So with anxious attachment, you would have potentially experienced inconsistent caregiving. It was all switched on. You were the best thing since sliced bread, and then you weren't important. Get out of my way. You're annoying me. So a push pull, a kind of like switched on all over you, and then go away from me. You're annoying me. And so this is the experience you might have had as a child with your parent being that anxious style. And then in adulthood, I'm massively generalizing, by the way, but just bear with. And then in adulthood, that might come out in lots of different types of behaviors. For example, clinginess behavior. Avoidant would be having a parent who is distant, not always responding to your needs. And then you as an adult might then start to feel suffocated. You might crave intimate relationships, but also you feel suffocated. And then the fearful avoidant is that combination of clingy and suffocated. So you kind of have periods of going through both. Definitely for me, I was your avoidant. I can see lots of clues throughout my past relationships. When I read about attachment theory, I was like, what? It all makes sense. And so I've done a lot of work, interestingly, through my friendships on building up secure attachments. How have I built up secure attachments? Well, I'll leave you with a couple of ideas. This is a biggie. Get clear on what commitment means. Whether you're thinking about this in your romantic relationships, your familial relationships, your friendships, colleagues, work colleagues, what does commitment mean? How does it show up for you? What are your expectations around how commitment is shown? How do you like to receive it? How do you like to give it? Have a conversation, because sometimes never the twain shall meet. So you think you're all over the commitment thing and you are giving so much commitment and showing your commitment, and the other person is like, when are they just going to show some commitment? So have a conversation around that. A couple of other things. Be aware of trust and how where the balance of power is, because there's been a lot of research about trust being in the hands of the giver. Trust being in we choose who we're going to give our trust to. And yet I certainly grew up with that. You need to earn my trust. You need to earn my trust. Well, actually, fine. I will be looking for clues. I will be looking for data to support whether I want to trust you or not. But actually, it is my decision to trust you or not. I'm the one that takes that leap. So looking at where that locus of control and power is around trust, and thinking about it as I give trust, I choose to give trust. And the third thing, focus on repair, because we're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to make mistakes. And so let's focus on actually what does repair look like? How, what things do I need to say, do, show up for, continue to do? What's the consistency? Repair, I think repair and consistency have to come hand in hand, making sure that that's weaved into your repair model. And again, having a conversation about what repair looks like, how you would like to receive it. And that's 29 minutes, if I do say so myself. So any questions? Any questions? A couple more books. One more book that I wanted to share. Love this book. Love's Not Colorblind. Love's Not Colorblind. Race and Representation in Polyamorous and Other Alternative Communities by Kevin A. Patterson. So I have got a book list. If you do want to join my AH coaching community, they're all on a book list in there. Or reach out to me and I can send you a copy of my book list if you're interested.
Yeah. That was amazing, Ali. Thank you so much. You managed to condense such a wonderful synthesis of so much into a short space of time. And I'm super grateful for that. And I was reflecting as you were talking, earlier today we had Michelle from Polyamorous Well Asian on, and we got talking a lot about how much therapy has supported us in our journey of solo polyamory. And I feel like you really brought home the importance of community in that as well. I look at the people we need aren't just our partners. We benefit from having therapists. We benefit from having elders or coaches. We benefit from having places where we can unpack our shadow stuff. And we also need those peers. We need those people that we don't date, who we have these deep trust relationships with. This theme of trust has come up a few times today already. Roy and I were talking about that earlier as well. And I really love how you brought in attachment theory there, because I'm on the same page as you. Like, there's been such a Western centric attitude to it. And I'm like, we didn't emerge in a nuclear family model. We didn't emerge in isolation. As human beings, we are communal creatures and we benefit from having extended community around us. And I think that is one of the big challenges that we have when we're wanting to be solo, is how do we maintain that agency and autonomy but not fall into that toxic individualism and that isolation, and how do we build that community? And I see some folks have been sharing some things in Zoom, and as you're talking about the different kinds of friendships and community, I'm like, yeah, I absolutely have those people, my go-to people. And I find that one of the things I've done in the last few years is really focus on how do I do the emotional labor first with those friends rather than defaulting to like wanting to do that with a romantic partner, because that's not always the vibe with different partners. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And just
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I love that. That's a really good awareness point. Who is the person who? Who is the person who? And sometimes we will default to that, the person who's right in front of us. And actually, as we're starting to tell that story, there's already this voice in our head saying, X would have a completely different view and might actually be the person you should be talking to right now. I think
yeah.
that's a really good reminder.
Thank you, Ali. And once again, if people want to find you, where do they find you online?
Right, so I'm mainly active on Instagram at Ali Hendry Coaching. Do check out the TED Talk if you are interested in learning more about my jealousy journey. It's called Survivor's Guide to Jealousy. And I also have a Facebook group called AH Coaching Community. And I've popped the links into the chat there. But yes, do reach out to me. If you can't find anything, we'll find it on my link tree. So yeah, go to Ali Hendry Coaching if you're an Instagram person, or AH Coaching Community Facebook.
Thank you, Ali. And I noticed that because I had sent you a direct message, when you pop those links in, it just sent it as a direct message to me. So you might just want to adjust that.
Oh, you sent me a direct message.
Um, I am going to say thank you so much. This was wonderful. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to mute you and unpin you so we can get ready for our next speaker. And I see some great comments in here. A lot of gratitude for the idea of having rituals with our friends and also establishing those routines. One of the things I got into during the first year of the pandemic, one of my bestest, like closest platonic partners in my life moved out to the community where I live, and we started doing walks every single Friday afternoon. And that was so wonderful, so nurturing for both of us. And even though she's now moved back into Vancouver and I'm still on the island, we still find those times to connect and have those talks and really deepen into those connections. And I cannot emphasize how important that's been for my own journey. I feel sure it's been that way for a lot of other solo polyamorists, but to have those people in your life who get you, who you don't date, who there isn't that dating, romantic, sexual, whatever that is for you, entanglement, that they are just your solid anchor points in a way. So moving ahead, I'm going to bring on our next guest. If I can find you, I saw you're here. Excuse me. There you are. Thanks, Sinclair. So I am absolutely thrilled to have Sinclair here. Many of you may know them through their work in the kink community, and I've been a fan of their Instagram feed for a while now. And I know, Sinclair, when we were kind of back and forth about topics, like I was thrilled when you filled out the form because you gave like 1,000 things you could talk about, and I was like, oh my God, I want to do like a whole conference with them. But like
Let's talk. We'll talk about that another time.
yeah. And I mean, your work is primarily in the kink community, and you do these wonderful workshops helping people to connect with how to do like erotic writing and so much more. And you've collaborated a lot with Marsha, who's going to be on in a little bit. And so I feel like kink is probably going to end up being part of our conversation today. But you said to me in email, like, what if we just focus more on this like idea of becoming your own beloved? And you'd expressed a willingness to share a little bit about your journey, perhaps in that. So yeah, do you want to introduce yourself to folks here, and then I
Sure.
can dive into some more questions.
Sure. So, my name is Sinclair Sexsmith. That's not my name at birth. That's the nom de plume or the nom de guerre that I use for most of my work. Primarily, I do writing and teaching and coaching around DS relationships and the many different aspects of things that go with DS, including other forms of BDSM or non-monogamy or queer things or gender things. I do a lot of teaching around strap-on sex as well, and a little bit, like I have a background as a sex educator and an erotica writer. So I was an editor for the Best Lesbian Erotica series for about 5 years. And now I'm leading erotica writing groups online, and the next one is starting in October. So that one is writingspicy.com. And there's a link to I put in the chat that is my main site is sugarbutch.net, and there's a link that is Find Sinclair, and that's like all the places to find me online. So it's got all the Instagram and Twitter, all those places that you can see my work.
Yay.
Yeah, I'm glad I caught Allie's talk. Thank you, Allie. That was great. That made me jot down a variety of things about ritual and routine, which I talk about in DS contexts a lot too, and about attachment. Not always, I mean, I feel like Polysecure really changed the conversation about attachment in the polyamory community, and beyond, really, anybody who's kind of adjacent to that too. And so it's surprising how different conversations with clients have been since that book came out, and people have so much more of a baseline understanding of attachment than they did before, I feel. And
Yeah.
a lot of really great conversations coming out of that book, and Polywise as well, the one that Jessica Fern just released. I finished it not that long ago, last week maybe, and it was very much worth reading too.
I'm looking forward to getting a hold of that. It's exciting, and it is great seeing so much more literature coming out that I think is grounded in not just people's own personal lived experience, but also in the experience of being someone in a helping profession who's working with them. Because I'm sure that you found this as well. Like as soon as you put on that coach hat or that educator hat, you get your eyes open to a whole other bunch of perspectives. And it takes you outside of your own experience. And there really is so much in there to explore. And yeah, I something you were saying earlier about the ritual and that Ali touched on, I know in my own solo polyamory journey, I've learned from the kink community. I've really learned from those kink practices about how to bring some of that into my relationships, because I feel like in the spiritual path I grew up in, I had a sense of how to do ritual for myself, but how to put that into play in my partnerships was different. And then I think there's a whole other piece of how do you create that in your partnerships in a way that you're not losing yourself, you're not losing that self relationship and not losing that agency.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that differentiates ritual from routine for me, is that ritual connects me with something bigger than myself, and which connects me with my partner too, if it's a relational ritual, but also connects the two of us or more, but mostly two, to something else that's bigger. And I say that very broadly. It could be God in kind of the broadest sense of the word. It could be a spirit, it could be the universe, it could be the collective unconscious, whatever it is. And so for me, if I'm continuing to keep an eye on whether this is connecting me to something bigger, that means that I inherently need to be there and be present and need to have some sort of sense of my own self showing up to the thing, right? Otherwise, if I can't feel that, then I'm losing my own sense of internal experience or my embodied experience at the same time.
And that element of being present to ourselves when we're in that ritualistic space. I think about the experiences I've had in my relationships where I have not been present to myself, and I have attempted to connect with a partner or connect with someone new. And
Sure.
when I'm not present to myself and I'm connecting with someone new, I know there's a higher risk of misreading the situation, of mistakes happening, of harm happening, of not being in a space of authenticity. And going back to one of the earlier conversations today about like, we're not in that space of collaboration if
Mm,
I'm not showing up as my authentic self.
mhm. Right. And there's so many ways, um, in when we also have an element of dominance and submission in a relationship we're playing with, the like collaborating can look really different, but I
Yeah.
think the collaboration is still there, or I mean, I don't want to say should, but for me, I want it there. I want to be co-creating that experience of um, surrender and of power in some form. And it's not necessarily just about something coming from the dominant and being dictated by like a top-down power structure, right? It's
Yeah.
like a collaborative power structure, which kind of seems counterintuitive maybe to how most people think about power, but that to me makes those interpersonal, like consensual, dynamic relationships much more smooth and work more effectively. But yeah,
Yeah.
collaboration is another key piece. And I think that like for me, there's also in ritual, to go back to that, a collaboration with spirit, a collaboration with the thing that's bigger than me, whatever that is. Um, and if I'm not tapping into that too, then there's a piece that's kind of missing.
I love that. I resonate with that so much. So much. Um, I'm curious to know more than like in your journey, and as much as you're comfortable sharing, this journey to becoming your own beloved. What has that been for you?
Hmm. Uh, the first thing that comes to mind is definitely a work in progress, right? It's not something that I feel like, okay, check, I did that, it's done, complete. But I think it has had a lot to do with um learning myself and kind of going on a journey about excavating my own shame and figuring out how to kind of live with the things about myself that I don't particularly like, and the things about myself that can, I don't know, go sideways in relationships, the things about myself that are hard or difficult or, challenging to live with or challenging to navigate, my bad habits, my tendencies to whatever. So uh, I think when I was running across a lot of challenges, like limitations kind of to my own dominance and the ways that it was hard for me to, show up as like the, I don't know, stereotype of a dom all the time, right? Which nobody can do all the time. That's not realistic. Maybe people can do it in a fantasy book, but that's why the fantasy books are there, because they're fantasy. And figuring out that like instead of ignoring the pieces of me that were getting in the way and trying to push them aside and like not acknowledge them and just like power through and show up as this other version of me anyway, to actually like bring those in and have that be part of how I show up, and to honor that that's part of the truth. That has been such a big steep learning curve, and has made a really huge difference in my ability to relate it, like show up to my dominance and submission and show up to my partners.
I love that turn of phrase that you used about excavating shame.
Mm,
Like I don't know if I've ever heard it phrased quite that way, but that's such a visceral image. And I think that is such an essential part. We were just talking about like earlier today, like we had, it's good to have a therapist. And I was talking with Ali, like it's good to have community. And I think to also have those spaces, and when we need the support to do it as well, that the space where we can excavate that shame and look at it.
Yeah.
And, as you were describing that, I'm thinking about how when I am deeply in love with somebody, I love them. And even though, in spite of seeing the shit that they're working on and the baggage they carry and all of those pieces, because none of us are perfect. None of us are like the final form that we're going to take. It's constantly this growth and this progression. And I think that being able to, when we notice that we can love people through their flaws and not even see them as flaws, but love their flaws too,
Mhm.
love the shadows they carry, love them in their shame experiences. Can we then do that for ourselves?
Mm,
And that is such a radical idea.
mm. Yeah. And I think so much of loving the flaws and loving the kind of more unconscious pieces of ourselves. I think a big piece of that is just bringing it conscious, just like just naming the things, just seeing that they exist, just acknowledging that they exist, talking about it, like and building in some like safety nets for these things that of whatever they are, right? Like if I struggle with mood fluctuation, not, and that's not really an if, I do struggle with that, and but if someone does, but I do, then acknowledging it, naming it, having some safety nets in place about like, this is the ritual, this is the routine that we do if my mood is starting to crash. This is the script. I mean, and I mean that kind of loosely, but this is the procedure that we do together. If I say, hey, I know I'm supposed to show up and like be a really amazing, top and dominant, and we had all these plans, we had negotiated scenes or whatever we'd done, but tonight, like, I am tanked and I'm just crashed, and they're like, oh, okay, well, let's go to plan B of what we do with when you are tanked or when I am tanked. And maybe that's, could be lots of things, right? Lately it's been more watching Steven Universe, but like other times it's other things. And or like making a meal from scratch, or doing some sort of other way of connecting, and some sort of other way of also still feeling into the power dynamic to some degree, but that can include anything. It can include my entire life. I want the power dynamic to be big enough so that I can show up as me and where I am. And same with the partner. I want the dynamic to be flexible enough and like porous enough to adapt to wherever we are. I don't want to have to adapt to this rigid power structure that, because like we're doing this for fun, ultimately. It's not a prescription. It's not like nobody's going to get fired because they're not respecting authority in the right way or something. That's not where we're coming from with this way of interpersonally relating with power. We're doing it to learn about ourselves and to feel, loved and connected and present. And I don't know, sometimes I feel like it's more of an orientation for people too, where they're like, I just really want to, I'm in charge in way too many areas of my life. I just want to give over, or I'm not in charge in way too many areas of my life. I just need an outlet to be like really controlling, or whatever it is. There's lots of reasons, but
Well, thank you for saying that. Like I know for me, I don't enjoy kink dynamics if it's not playful. I go into like kink parties, and there's always the domly doms who are very serious about things, and I'm sure that's working for them, otherwise they wouldn't be doing it. But that's definitely not my approach, and the playfulness is definitely what matters to me. And I think in that playfulness, to have that expansiveness of, there's so many
Yeah.
ways we can explore this. And I love what you mentioned about naming the things.
Mm.
And I even encourage folks, and I do this myself, like literally give it a name. Like
Mhm,
when you
mhm,
know that there's like a piece of shame or a piece of trauma or like a piece that's particularly tender, some narrative in yourself, literally give it a name, because then you can talk about how to relate to that part. And I know during the pandemic, I really, really connected with this part of this like shame part of myself, and I call it the drudge. And
mm,
I have
mm,
drawn it as like this big round ball,
mm,
and the story that the drudge has is, I need to be small so that other people can feel better about themselves. But the drudge is huge and takes up all this space and just kind of tries to like roll around, and it's like, but I'm trying to be small. And
mm,
being able to articulate that now, even just to myself,
mhm,
has been liberating, to be like, oh yeah, that's what's happening right now, and here's what we need to do to just let the drudge know that he's loved
mm,
and cared for and can take up space as well. And when we have that language in our relationships, it is a powerful way to support that self-love, for sure.
mm, mhm, mhm. Right, because if you can name it, you can shorthand it, and someone else can, name it too. I also feel like sometimes when we name things, they have less power, they have less, they do actually get a little smaller, take up less room,
Totally.
but they get bigger and bigger when we're not naming them, right? It's that whole elephant in the room idea of like what nobody's gonna say, nobody, we're just not gonna talk about how the emperor has no clothes on, we're just going to ignore that entirely and pretend like, okay, I see. Like it just gets bigger and bigger in this like psychic space. And I
100%.
think excavating shame, like bringing things conscious, making things conscious, and like spending time with some of those parts of myself that I am not proud of, that has been a big piece of that whole idea and journey of like becoming your own beloved, which speaking of which, I'll just say that phrase, become your own beloved, Lee Harrington just released a book with that title, and that one of my book groups just finished, so that was partly I think where that was coming from when I mentioned it. But he talks about having like a marriage ritual with himself to marry himself, and the process of coming to be his own partner and what that means and
Mhm.
in his life. And he gives a lot of different exercises, and write a love letter to yourself, take yourself on a date, these kind of things that were really sweet. And I enjoyed reading it, and I also felt like, wow, I really 20 years ago, early 20s me really could have used reading this book. I think I learned a lot of those lessons more the hard way. And I'm so glad it's in the world, and that you could just kind of have that information laid out in a
Yeah.
workbook now. But
I
it's
mean, I remember coming across people talking about like self partnering and self
yeah.
marriage rituals years ago. And this is when I was in a supposedly monogamous marriage. I was like, that sounds interesting, but that's kind of weird. And then here I am years later, like I am my own primary partner. And there's a astrologer, Rob Bresney, who has he wrote the book Pronoia, and in there is a really beautiful suggestion as well for like I me wed. It's
Mhm.
called, and I have a printout of that on my little relationship altar over on that side of my room, that goes through like the self commitments. And I wear this ring that's basically a family heirloom, but it's my reminder to myself of my primary relationship there.
Mm, I love that. How did you come to that? Like aside from, you know, from monogamous marriage, that's weird that people do that too, 11 years, right? Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, 11 years and counting. It's gone pretty well. Um I mean, when I came out of my marriage, I knew that I didn't want to go back into that, and I knew that I wanted to explore polyamory. And I was doing what I think is the classic uh bisexual girl starting into polyamory journey of dating couples and being a unicorn, and I enjoyed that.
Mm,
And then I started dating one guy, and it was a very intense erotic connection. And I fell into that escalator monogamy hangover trap of all these unconscious expectations of like the Disney fantasy and all of that. And and eventually was confronted with, what the heck am I thinking? Like, that is not at all what this is.
Mm.
And so many people were asking me, like, well, who's your primary? Do you have a primary partner? Yada, yada, yada. And, you know, in the spiritual community that I grew up in, the spiritual practice I was raised in, one of our teachers has a teaching, which is honor yourself, worship yourself, know yourself. The divine dwells within you as you.
Mhm.
And I leaned back into that and I was like, well, what if I'm my own primary partner? What if I just tell people that and actually act on that and treat myself as my own primary, as an antidote of sorts to
Mm.
the pull of that Disney mythology of all the monogamy programming that was wanting me to gravitate towards having somebody else as my primary, because I felt like that was just going to take me back into all the enmeshment and
Mhm.
codependency that I was
Mhm.
really, really working on getting out of. And I mean, I think it's still a work in progress. Like the last few weeks, I've had a whole bunch of epiphanies of like, wow, that is stuff from 20 years ago. And I apparently wasn't ready to look at that until this week. Great.
Wow. Yeah.
You know, it is an ongoing journey.
And it comes when it comes. And I feel like sometimes we don't have the tools, or, it almost feels like sometimes I put on a new pair of glasses and then I look back on like the timeline of my life, and all of a sudden a whole nother color is there that wasn't there before, right? Like you just
Right.
get this new lens on the past and then things change, which is one of the fascinating things about both like memory, which changes, but also, I don't know, getting older, I think, and getting maybe wiser, hopefully wiser, and like being able to actually change my relationship with events that have happened in the past.
Well, I think another element in there is that as a non-monogamous community at large, and also within the circles of relationship anarchy and solo polyamory, like we have been working on articulating our own experiences more, especially in the
Mhm,
last decade, and that's been accelerated by the technology changes to be able to do things like this today. Um,
mhm,
and I think we empower ourselves with more language.
mm,
And the more we empowered and the more we empower ourselves in the community at large, like we're sharing that information, we're figuring it out as we go along. And I look back to 10 years ago, there was nothing about solo polyamory. There was
mm,
nothing about how to be your own primary partner. There was none of these resources available. And now we have those resources. We have the podcast, we have the people we can follow, we have books that we can reach out to. And I think that is really incredible. Like I was talking at the beginning of the day about one of the things I love about the solo polyamory community is that we come together over this shared value if we don't want to be enmeshed with others. And then we also discover the differences that we have and we honor those and we get curious about them.
mm.
And I think from that, there's so much more language and tools and resourcing that we've done.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's just so much, and there's so many more people just sharing their lives, right? Like just
Yeah.
not necessarily being coaches or educators, but just like posting about what their life is like in various places, social media, on message boards, and um writings online of various kinds, I think, in groups, things like that, Facebook groups. Some of the conversational groups that exist are just so robust. There's so many resources of just people's lived experiences. And often when we're existing like on the margins of a margin of a margin, there aren't very many books. There's more now, but there's not very many. So you go, and like the resources are other people and who they're, just what they're expressing about what they've learned and how they operate, what they do, whatever. I
Oh,
think,
I
yeah.
agree. I think that's one of the things that has made the solo polyamory Facebook group so good is like
Mm,
there is that curation of like we're really here to discuss this and support each other. And I love diving in there and looking at the threads and conversations. I learned so much from the community.
mhm. I
We
love
are
what you
coming.
said about act like being your own partner and actually acting on that, because I also think that the idea of being your own partner, and like it was very much more conceptually for me for a long time,
Yeah.
and like taking actual steps to do things with myself, get comfortable being, spending time alone, aka with myself, right? And like enjoying that and having that actually be not just a like, well, nobody else is around, I guess I'll be with myself tonight, but like I might even have other options, but I'm choosing that this time is going to be delightful for me to just do what I want to do together with whatever, my art or my journal or my writing or not, or whatever.
Totally. Like
Yeah.
it's not just the act or incidental time to fold laundry.
Yes.
It could be that,
Could be.
but you could spice it up.
Right.
Yeah. We are coming
Right.
up to the top
And
of
how
the
do we do
hour.
that consciously too, right? Like how do we, if it is time to fold laundry, what's the way that I'm going to bring consciousness and intentionality to that?
I love it. So we are at the top of the hour, Sinclair, and I am so grateful. This has been a really awesome opportunity to chat with you. If folks want to find you again, how can they find you?
Sugarbitch.net has all the info /find-Sinclair. I put the links in the chat there. That's the big, the link with all the links on it. And if you want to work with me, I do coaching around DS. A lot of my clients are non-monogamous in some form. I have an erotica writing group coming up that starts in October. So if you want to know more about that, it's writingspicy.com, or feel free to DM me on all the places. Send me an email, etc. If you have any questions. Thanks so much for having me. This has been so lovely to listen to so far, and I'm looking forward to hearing more.
Thanks for being here. And I'm so stoked. Thank you, Sinclair. It's been rad. I am going to now unpin you, and I'm going to bring on the fabulous Marcia. Add pin. Hello. I feel like I'm hanging out with like the Bay Area folks right now this afternoon.
Claire's in Seattle now.
Oh, right, of course. But like I feel like it's like not just about the geography of the Bay Area. There's like a spirit to the Bay Area. Like when I was a teenager, people used to think I was from the Bay Area, even though I'd never lived there. Still have not lived there, but I know my way around pretty well. So hi.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. For those of you who don't know the wonderful Marcia B, this is Marcia, and she was an instrumental person in my journey. I may make you blush, and I am totally okay with that. So one of the first people I dated in my solo polyamory journey who really understood what I was talking about turned out to be friends with Marcia. And he was like, I feel like you should really check out my friend Marcia's work. I feel like you would really get along and you'd get a lot from what she's doing. And I was still fairly like that shiny new thing in the poly community, and I was just like ready to absorb everything like a sponge. And I signed up for Marcia's Good Girl Recovery program that was running at the time, and I was like, yes, this is amazing. And I feel like I got so much wisdom from you, and practices as well about how to recognize my boundaries and how to work with that in my relationships. And you did this wonderful thing for me. You wrote me a permission slip that I had permission to ask for what I wanted in my relationships and to take up space and all these wonderful things. And I still have that permission slip. It still sits in with my things. It's still important to me to this day. So welcome, Marcia.
Hey,
do you want to add some more to your introduction here? Because I haven't even said about like all the other amazing things that you do.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just do the quick bio. My website's askingforwhatyouwant.com. I'm really interested in sexual communication and consent education. I wrote a book that came out last year called Creating Consent Culture, a Handbook for Educators. My background is varied, and I've been polyamorous or some sort of consensual non-monogamy since the late 20th century. And when this conversation around solo polyamory started up about, I don't know, 10 years ago, I was like, oh, this rings bells, but I didn't have any language for it. So I'm thrilled to be here. I've done a lot of work in the non-monogamy world. And I'm really just very keen on helping people to notice that they want things and then talk about them.
It sounds so simple when you say it.
Yeah, it's not. Or it's simple. It's simple. It's not easy. It's actually a lot simpler than we make it. It's just hard to learn how to make it simple.
I'm reminded of something that comes from like game designers, like easy to learn and hard to master.
Mm-hmm. I'm not
Like
sure to learn though.
yeah, like yeah, I think everybody has that moment of epiphany where like the puzzle pieces kind of suddenly slot in together. Or at least hopefully we have that moment of epiphany. And it's like, oh, it makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So what's your journey in solo polyamory been like? You know, you said you you resonated with what you were starting to hear 10 years ago, and I know that that's not necessarily how you were again one of those people who's like, this is not my like prescriptive identity.
Yeah. Yeah, so I grew up in the South and had a fairly straightforward, factually straightforward sex education, but not a very like feminist or pleasure oriented or anything like that. And I was very deeply curious about sex and sexuality. And I left, I moved to New York City. I was living with a partner that I had dated in college who is still a dear friend of mine. And when we moved in together in 2000, we were already non-monogamous. We had no idea what we were doing. We had bought the first edition of the Ethical Slut. They're on the third edition now. This is making me feel really old. And when we moved in together, with like my third or fourth paycheck out of college, I was like, I need to remember to, so I guess the important thing to say about the conservative background is marriage was the thing, right? We were dating in college. We knew we wanted to move to New York together. And we had a conversation that was like, should we get married? And the conclusion was, we don't want to get married and we don't want to break up. So what does that mean? And that was the kind of catapulted both of us into a big exploration of what relationships could be, how we wanted to do things. I had been a women's studies student in university, so I already had this like burgeoning sense of, I think marriage is maybe not the deal that everyone tries to convince women that it is. So I had a lot of baby thoughts, like early little tendrils of, I should wait and listen and like pay attention. I don't know to what, but I had that kind of a feeling. And so with my third or fourth paycheck out of college, I went to the mall and I bought myself a ring. And I wore it on my middle finger. I didn't wear it on my ring finger, but I bought myself this just like $70 white gold, like 10 karat white gold ring. It was probably, I don't know, it was plated probably, but whatever. And I was like, this is my reminder to make sure that the choices I'm making serve me in the long term, not serve some idea or somebody else's agenda. And that was kind of it. Like that was like Sinclair was saying, like there were no books back then. Like there was like one or two books about polyamory at all, and none of them were talking about this. And so that was it. That I bought this ring and I wore it for many, many years. And then in like, I think 2010 or so, about 10 years later, I was like, I think I've internalized this lesson. And I think there's something now for me next. And I think the thing that's for me next is less. Also, it's important to say too, perhaps, that I was also very steeped in like a neoliberal individualist mentality back then too. So in 2010, I was at Burning Man and I actually left my ring in the temple. I burned the ring in the temple, not because it didn't still matter to me, but because I felt I had integrated the lessons that part of my life was about. And I knew there was something next, and it took me a few years to realize like, oh, it's something community, but also that word's really loaded. it's something chosen family. Family is also a really loaded word, but there's something there. And again, there wasn't the language at the time. I was kind of feeling my way in the dark. I had read Wendy O'Maddock's Redefining Our Relationships, which to me is a very early relationship anarchy book, although I don't think she uses that term in the book, and kind of found my way into looking back. I would now put that label on it. Just like looking back, I would put the label solo polyamory on what I was doing, you know, in the noughties, in the 2000s.
Yeah.
So then I've spent now, you know, whatever, approximately a decade and a half, sort of like, what does it mean to be a self-possessed individual functioning relationally in community, in small community, not in like scenes. You've heard me make my whole rant about how communities and scenes are not the same thing. And that we're accountable, and who am I accountable to, and who's accountable to me, and how do we build relationships that include sex and dating and romance, but also include nurturing and care that may not have anything to do with that, especially in non-traditional sort of queer contexts, which is what I'm operating inside of. And of course, as you mentioned, I'm in the Bay Area, so it's a very fertile place for a lot of those conversations.
And for those who have not heard that rant about the difference between scenes and community, you can probably just start to think about what that difference is for yourself. But I know one of the places that you and I have talked about this a lot is like Burning Man.
Mm-hmm.
Like Burning Man is a big thing. You know, I think they're now up to like 80,000 people go each time or something like that. And so that's a lot of people to be a single community. I think there's many sub communities within that.
The queer community, the polyamory community, these are not communities. They are they're affinity groups.
Yeah.
Inside of those, people have parties and events where you might develop a lot of closeness. But if that closeness doesn't extend outside of the event, then I would hesitate to actually call it a community. I would say it's a more of a scene. And I think everybody escalates, right? The thing that they're trying to get is like, scenes are called communities are called families, and I don't know what families are. It's just like, well, but I think that speaks to a hunger that we have for intimacy and for connection and for belonging and for being part of a network, being part of a web. And so we use the language, but then when the community doesn't come through for us, and we have the expectations of community, or the chosen family doesn't come through for us, or only comes through at the community level, not at the family level, there's so much hurt, sadness, upset, and loss and grief. And so making those distinctions and being clear, like, wait, what are we actually doing here, has been part of the journey for me around how do I actually have sort of authentic, non-hierarchical, non-authoritarian relationships.
And I think as a kind of added element in that, you know, we've talked a lot today about relationship anarchy without talking about it. And you know, there is such an overlap between the RA community and the solo poly community, but not everyone who practices solo polyamory resonates with relationship anarchy. And in addition, I think there's a lot of confusion about what relationship anarchy is, and a lot of misunderstandings of relationship anarchy versus relationship libertarianism. And, you know, I talk a lot about that on my social media feed, but I certainly didn't coin that term. I wish I had. It's a brilliant term.
I know a friend of mine who I can't remember who it is, I think is the person who came up with it. And I was like, that's the thing.
That is the thing. And a lot of people, you know, it takes a while to kind of wrap your head around, like, libertarianism and anarchism are different. They might appear on surface to have similar values because they are both saying, I don't want to adhere to a certain system. But libertarianism is going off into, I think, that hyper individualism, no systems of governance, no community building, although there is some levels of that because inevitably we're communal creatures. But relationship anarchy, the values of political anarchy are so much around community care, mutual aid, building networks of resilience to be able to oppose oppressive orders, and so on and so forth. And I feel like that is when you describe about your community building experiences and like that hunger people have where they get disappointed or let down when community doesn't come through, there's that hunger towards that network of support, that the nurturing of resilience through an ecology of relationships that I think goes beyond our intimate sexual romantic partnerships.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I also think it's a little bit of a sticky wicket in the US, at least, to talk about relationship anarchy without really defining terms. I generally don't like label myself that. I wouldn't, if I was on a dating app, I wouldn't put that on there. I feel like there's just way too much potential for misunderstanding. And like I said, for me, it's more of a term that when I look back, kind of, again, what Sinclair was talking about, when you look back and you look through these different lenses, you're like, oh, that's what I was doing this whole time. But I think that, that desire for connection and for community, for family, for belonging, another place that I see people make mistakes. And I think this is a lesson that, again, I would kind of put this lesson under the RA umbrella, is that people will often relate to a group, relate to a polypod, will relate to a community, will relate to a scene, and then not build the actual individual relationships that sustain the belonging. And they'll devote energy to an organization, but not have the relationships. There's a tendency, because we're so socialized, to relate to institutions and organizations, to relate to the institutions and the organizations, and forget that they're actually just made of people. It's all people, like it's all made up of people. And I've had people come into my poly network. It's very interesting when breakups happen. I find it very interesting in my own poly network when breakups happen. There seems to be a shaking out that occurs where, in some cases, a breakup happens and then the other relationships are sustained, and then that person kind of stays in. Somebody comes into a friend group, they date somebody or polypod or whatever, and then the breakup happens, but they're still kind of around. And in those cases, what I've noticed is two things. One, generally good behavior in terms of like not being, a menace. But also that person almost always has built actual friendships, actual individual relationships, and is not just like, oh, my partner's friends, my partner's other partners, my partner's pod. And I've also seen it be the case where someone is not a menace, is a good person, is lovely, and that breakup happens, and then they lose the entire group. They lose their friend group. And what's happening there is, yeah, everybody liked that person. There's no bad blood, there's no bad feeling, but the individual connections, the effort put into forming those bonds isn't there. And that could be because the primacy of the romantic relationship supersedes the idea of friendships with other people. It could be an over insistence on autonomy. Like, yes, I like your friends, but those are your friends, and I don't want to have your friends be my friends, or your pod be my pod, or whatever. Or it could be that they're relating to the group as a group and not as individuals. And I find that any of those things is another place where people get really sad and upset when something falls. I wouldn't even say falls apart, when something shifts, right? When a relationship shifts. And that tending to having the care for the individual relationships is really key. And I noticed this in particular. I live in a co-op with 7 people, there's 7 of us total, 6 other people. And when I moved in, that was something that they said, and that was something that really sparked my attention as, oh yeah, this is a good situation. Because the other housemates were saying, look, if you move into this house, we don't want you to relate to it as a house, as a household. We all put a lot of attention on tending to our individual relationships, and they all look different. They're not all the same. They're not all the same level of intimacy, but there is a tending to. So then I was like, okay, I told my partner at the time, I was like, hey, I'm moving into this house. And in true RA fashion, I was like, I think I just took on another major relationship / 6 of them.
Yeah. I mean, I resonate with that experience hugely. Like, I've had 2 experiences of living in community houses in my last decade. And it is an intimate relationship. It's a nesting relationship. It's often a non-sexual, non-romantic nesting relationship. That's not to say there haven't been follicular connections between myself and some of those roommates at times, but yeah. And even when I've just had one roommate, like right now, I am managing to live by myself. We'll see how long that goes for, with current cost of living, et cetera. But you know, it's a whole other relationship, and the complexities of those relationships are every bit as complex as you would have in a polycule. I like using the term anercule more these days, just to be able to describe, like, it's not just my partners, it's also my chosen family and my friends. And when I've had nesting people, like, who are they? And yeah, it's a lot of dynamics to wrap our heads and our hearts around.
Yeah, and I think that you know, the speaking to the cost of living, right? Like there's a lot of things that so it's a little bit of a tangent, but we said we were going to talk about this, so it's not that much of a tangent. But like, I started my non-monogamy journey in North Georgia, in college town, and we didn't know what we were doing, and it was all new. So that didn't really, and we were college students, like we had no assets and we weren't looking to stay and all of that. We moved to New York City, and I got very involved in a polypod network there, that was both social and activist, and everybody had these tiny little apartments. So like the dream of the big house is not happening in New York City. New York City, the way like zoning and real estate and cost of living and access to resources really meant hyper atomized, like autonomy, like little individuals and couples with tiny apartments all over town. And then we had keys to each other's house. And there was a lot of like, hey, can I come over? Because so-and-so is having a date. And like, there is no other room. Like we're living in one bedrooms or studios.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of like, hey, my partner's trying to have a date. Can I come over and like take a bath at your house? Like, you know, stuff like that. Or can I come spend the night? And that very much shaped it. And then when I moved to the West Coast, I noticed immediately that there was this whole other way that people were doing non-monogamy and doing just able to do different arrangements that were not so atomized, because there were just a lot of big old Victorians around, and they were not necessarily cheap. But you know, I had a big mansion, and you saw the house I had. There was a big, you know, 4-bedroom, 2-car garage, like with a spectacular view of the entire bay and the Golden Gate Bridge. And, you know, you put 5 or 6 paying adults in that house, it starts to become more affordable. And you can have like pretty luxurious lifestyle in a place that is very expensive because you can pool resources. And so I think there's a thing too, when we talk about these things and when we think about how much of the writing and thinking about solo polyamory, relationship anarchy, chosen family are coming out of these urban centers with high costs of living and large houses available. That doesn't apply in the same way in the suburbs of Ohio. That doesn't apply in the same way in Winnipeg or North Dakota or whatever. Like, I don't know why I'm focusing on the northern states, or Florida, whatever. Like, it's just, they're very different. And I think that we would do well to, sometimes in the solo poly group, I see people get real worked up on like, are you solo poly if you live with a partner? And I'm like, have you seen the economics of different people's situations? Like, economic, we're not separate from it. And the in particular, what the housing stock is, what the zoning laws are. There's also weird things like in certain parts of Pennsylvania, if you are not allowed to have 4 or more unmarried women living together because it's considered a brothel.
Wow.
So like the sorority houses in I think it was in Pittsburgh, the sorority houses are not sorority houses the way you would think of on a college campus. They're like all these apartments of 4 girls. And so there's a lot of this kind of stuff that we just never think about, and we make assumptions that what it's like here is like what it's like somewhere else. And then I see a lot of judgment getting thrown around in the online communities around that. And I think it's just important to name that there's a lot of stuff that's not about our philosophy and not about even marriage policy that shapes our relationships and shapes what we feel like we have access to. And it also, like, you might not need to live, 8 people in a house if you live in Ohio. You might just be able to afford a nice house in the suburbs somewhere. And I'm like, what's that like?
Right. And I love talking about this because I mean, when the question of like, can you be nesting with someone and be solo polyamorous comes up in the group, I've seen that conversation change over the past 10 years. And I am definitely someone who at the beginning was like, no, you cannot. That's like the opposite. And then I realized like, well, that's actually the economic reality. And I think increasingly with cost of living and inflation, certainly in Canada, the cost of housing is ridiculous right now.
Mhm.
And I have friends who are looking for a new rental because the house they've been renting is being sold. It's a 4-bedroom 1970s house that is definitely needs a lot of work, and it's selling for like 800,000 Canadian dollars. It's ridiculous.
Mhm.
And yeah, sometimes the reality is we do need to figure out nesting, and if that is, how then do we maintain that non-enmeshment, that
Mhm.
agency, and navigating the other pieces that can come along with nesting? Because certainly in Canada, as soon as you are cohabitating with a partner, you're considered common law.
Mhm.
And that changes things in terms of disability, benefits, tax credits,
Mhm.
medical, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Um, but I also really enjoy getting creative with the resource sharing.
Mhm.
So like, I, for the last couple of years, I have lived solo, but still like, okay, how do we share our streaming networks
Yeah.
within the Anarchule? How do we pull resources for growing food? Like I have a limited balcony space, and one of my best friends lives 10 minutes up the road and has a huge garden. So I got to plant acorn squash in her garden this year, and I just harvested some beautiful acorn squash. So, there's other kinds of resource sharing that we
Yeah.
can get creative around.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, again, I was doing this solo poly thing before there was a name for it. I wouldn't even say before it was cool, because I think it's always been cool, but
You're an elder.
I don't even. I'm like, I guess if you've been doing it for like half your life, then maybe that's true. But yeah, I am over half my life now. But yeah, when I look back again, I was living with a partner. We were pursuing the thing. I bought myself the ring. We broke up. We kept living together for another 2.5 years after we broke up because we were great housemates.
Mm.
We would occasionally hook up, and now we're still friends. We both moved cross country with some side trips in between. And then I had another partner who moved in because he just really needed a place to live. And I was like, well, I'm in the basement and the third floor has got a room. Like, if we could live in the same house as far apart from each other as possible, this might work. And it did get confusing and messy because at the time I didn't have a lot of the language to talk about the things. And because he was kind of newer to polyamory in general, that one, but it was like fine. And then, I've lived in community houses where like, then you start seeing somebody because you just have chemistry or whatever. And like, that could go really badly or really great. I've seen it go both directions. And so
Same.
is sleeping with somebody, does that mean you're now dating? Like, if you live together and you're sleeping together, are you now nesting partners? Not necessarily. Right, like there's nesting, and that's a separate activity for me because the most of the people I nest with I do not have a romantic or sexual relationship with. We actually had a conversation in my household about it and decided that that none of us would call each other our nesting partners because that does have a romantic sexual connotation to it. But we decided that because there's so many of us, we're the nesting posse. This is my nesting posse.
Oh, I love that. That question around the like, what is the scope, what's the sandbox of the relationship, came up
Yeah.
for me. And both times I've lived in a community house, where like the one in Vancouver, we agreed that we wouldn't date the same people, like because that just several of us had that awkward experience of like, I'm having extra FOMO because you're on a date with the person I want to be on a date with right now. Or like, I had a rough day and I really want to talk to them, but I can't, but they're in the other room.
Yeah.
Um, And then the other community house I lived in more recently, you know, we just before the pandemic, we had started to host like sexier parties, and we had the space to do it in a really wonderful way. That it's like, if you just want to have a vanilla experience, you can be here. If you want to explore a bit more, you can be here. If you want to explore more and more, you can go upstairs. And you know, it brought up that conversation within the household of like, what are our boundaries with each other, and like, how do we navigate this not getting awkward, not getting sticky in the like not comfortable way, not in the sexy way. And I think similar conversations would probably come in useful if you are looking to nest with somebody who's a partner.
Absolutely.
And that question of like, well, if we are nesting because of, you know, what is the reason that we're choosing to nest?
Right.
Are we doing that because it's one of those shoulds, or is it because this is an economic reality? This feels like it makes sense for us. How are we consciously, mindfully choosing that?
Are we resentfully choosing it because it's an economic reality? Because that's sometimes true too.
Totally. And I mean, like my marriage, I stayed in that marriage longer than I probably should have because of the economic reality I was in at the time. And so like, if we need to nest, does it need to necessarily be with a partner, or can it be with that nesting posse?
Yeah. And my partner lives alone. My main squeeze, like they live alone. They're an introvert. It's a great setup for us because when I need to get away from all my 6 housemates, I have a place to go. When they get lonely, they come to my house. They're friends with all my housemates. They have a door code. You know, there's so many ways, and it doesn't have to be with the person that you are madly in love with, or, you know.
I love it.
I would drive my partner crazy. We live together. It's a terrible idea.
Marcia, we are at the half hour. Thank you so much for joining me for this
Absolutely.
chat. Once again, if people want to find you, where do they find you?
That you can find me at askingforwhatyouwant.com, and I am very active on Instagram, in particular at Ask Marcia B. But I'm kind of all over the internet under that handle, just not very active other places.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marcia. It's been a delight having you here today.
Thank you.
I am gonna mute you, and Roz, where are you, Roz? I know I saw you here earlier. Scrolling through. There you are. Found you. So I am stoked to have one of my fellow mod squad from the Solo Poly group here. And welcome, Roz.
Hi.
2 summers ago now, I think, like in the middle of the pandemic, I found myself in Oakland staying with Marcia. I won't go into the whole saga of how I ended up there. And I was like walking around Oakland, which is a place close to my heart. And I posted a picture, I think, of like an electric box. And Roz was like, "Hey, you're in Oakland. We should go for coffee." And I was like, "Oh my God, that's right. You live here too." And it turns out Roz was living in the same building as Marcia. So like, it was one of those moments of like big universe, small world.
Yeah.
So Roz, you are one of the wonderful mod squad team who helped keep the Solo Polyamory group running smooth, chugging along. And oh yeah, and Marcia adds like you and Roz, you didn't know each other either. Like you were like a floor away or something. So you help keep the group running, and I'm always so grateful for your input in the group. You bring so much wisdom, and I think so much grounding into the discussions and conversations. And you helped organize the Solo Polyamory On Conference when it happened in San Francisco. And you also write about your SOPO experiences. So I'd love to invite you to introduce more about yourself and where people can find your sharings.
Oh, sure. Thank you. So where you can find me is on my Facebook page. I technically have a blog called Loving Solo, which is a play on the old Black 90s sitcom Living Single. It's like not necessarily living solo, because that's complicated in solo polyamory, but like loving solo. And my Facebook page is where I pump our blog writings to. I also like it just because a large part of how I got invested and involved in kind of engaging about solo polyamory was through the groups, through the solo polyamory group, but I also am a member of a lot of the larger Black polyamory Facebook groups, and I engage in those from a space of talking about solo polyamory as well. And then recently I've started a TikTok, which is also loving solo, and it has my name Roz on there as well, so you can find me. I talk a lot more about disability and neurodiversity than I do about polyamory, because I'm in a season in my life where I'm no longer in the long-term relationships that I was in, and I am discovering a lot of stuff about myself, particularly around like my capital D disability identities. And I just find that to be the thing that is taking up a lot of my time and energy, more so than romantic relationships, which is part of the reason why I have the focus that I do for what I wanted to talk about today. Yeah, but that's where you can find me. I'm on TikTok. I sometimes talk about polyamory there. I talk about stability a lot. And then I'm on Facebook. Usually the best way to find me is just me commenting on random things in the groups though. And you'll know it's me because it'll be an essay, long comment.
I love it. I just added you on TikTok. That's great. I didn't know you were doing
awesome.
that now. That's awesome.
Thank
So yeah, let's talk about disability and ability in solo polyamory and all of that jazz, because I feel like we just kind of started to touch on that topic with Marcia around like the intersections of privilege and the reality. And I mean, right from the beginnings of the solo polyamory group, this was one of the conversations that I think was starting to come up, is like, for many of us, that solo poly identity can be a way for people who live with disabilities of different sort to reclaim agency, because there's a lot around the experience of disability that can leave you feeling like you have to depend on others. And yet there's an inherent challenge in that when you have a disability, there are some things you may not be able to accomplish by yourself. You may need assistance in whatever form that looks like.
And I think the tension between those two has become, I think, for a lot of us, having gone through this global mass disabling event, but also for those of us who, were disabled before it, really live with and are playing with that tension when we're thinking about what does it mean if you perceive solo polyamory to be primarily about living alone or being very independent, as opposed to kind of the frameworks that came up earlier in the conversation around self-partnership or being deeply in love with self. I usually tend to talk about it as this idea of being like loving myself and showing love for myself just as deeply as I do showing love for any other person that I'm in a relationship with. So every relationship I have is full of love for that person, but also full of love for me, right? At the same time. And one is not sacrificed for the other to the best that I'm able to do that. Or I try to catch myself when I notice that happening, that kind of thing, right? Which is really good. But when you think of solo polyamory, or at least I think it's really good, right? I'm invested in it. But when you think of solo polyamory, primarily about the solo and not about the love parts of it, right? Navigating life with disability completely alone is something that requires quite a lot of privileges and resources to be able to do, right?
Yeah.
It's not that nobody can do it, but it requires a lot of resources. And yet, as you said, some of us, our access needs are related to needing to be alone. Certainly, like I live by myself now, and I didn't always, although never lived with a partner, but I didn't always live by myself. And it was a real access need for me to have space that was completely my own so that I could sort through some things and deal with like symptoms of like hypervigilance and things like that that were like kind of constantly getting in the way, symptoms of like avoidance of spaces that I needed to utilize in an everyday manner if I had to co-share that space with other human beings. It just was really not good for me. And like being able to live by myself shifted that. And I needed that for a time. I think something that I really appreciate about this conversation that we're having is like the acceptance of change, and that like what our access needs, you all aren't using this language, but I'll use it. Access needs meaning like the things that we need due to the ways that our disabilities, the ways that how we interact with the world and create a need in order for us to be able to access the world, because it's not set up for how our bodies or our minds work, right? So that's access needs. And so as my access needs have changed across time, or I've understood them differently, like, you know, there was a period of time in my life where I understood many things that I now see as access needs as like personal failures and flaws, right?
Yeah.
And then I began to get different language around it and accept it as maybe it's not something, it's a way that I'm different, but it's not exactly something that's bad. And then now I'm in this iteration where I'm like, it's not even just that it's bad, it's that it's a reasonable outgrowth of these ways that I'm different. And it's just that the world is not like this thing, this job, this household environment, this relationship I was in, the world at large was just not set up to work well with what my needs are, right? Anyway, so I think that tension is really challenging, and it's even more challenging because it's so common for us to perceive and to be told that our access needs are personal failures, because disability is something that we don't talk about often, and ableism is so pervasive because it props up so many other forms of oppression, right?
Yeah, I resonate with what you're saying about like the access needs can be tied to that drive for soloness. You know, I live now with long COVID, and alongside that, I've received like I meet the criteria for chronic fatigue syndrome as well. And I mean, maybe they're the same thing, maybe they're not. But anyway, you know, and living with the reality of that, you know, I feel very fortunate to be navigating that in a resourced way. And certainly I've seen a lot of improvement from where it was 2 years ago. But even so, like I'm realizing that one of my access needs around that is the downtime, for the pacing, for the resting, to be able to recover my energy, to recoup. And I think if I lived with a partner or had a full-time partner, like I don't know where I'd be finding that capacity. I don't know that I would have anything beyond the relationship. And, you know, when we look at how mononormativity functions, there's so much expectation of you are going to prioritize that person in your life. And the reality of certainly the disabilities that I live with now is that my priority has to be me. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. If I'm not consciously navigating, monitoring my energy and prioritizing my needs and my care, then I'm going to run out of steam, and I'm going to burn out, and I'm going to have flare-ups, and then I'm going to have nothing for anybody else.
I find I'm dealing with many things, but one of them is like a condition that gives me like pretty chronic pain and headaches and things like that. And so also a spoonie, like you're talking about. And one of the things that I find is like this complex relationship between those things is I have so little energy. The idea of having to navigate managing my home space in a way that works for me, but also works for another person, and what all of their needs feels really, really overwhelming. And at the same time, I can recognize that, like, man, sometimes it would be really, really nice to have somebody to help, because it is more work to have to do it all yourself, right? It takes more energy, which I already have a lot less of. But it would not be, to me, it would not be reasonable or fair to live with someone and expect everything about the way that the house works to be only catered to what I need, right? I do think that, the reality of some folks with disabilities is that they have high enough support needs or access needs for like what their lived experience looks like, that a lot of what their living space looks like has to be catered to what works for them, even if they live with other people, but it's never everything, right? And I totally think that for some folks, it is worthwhile to figure out the balance between those things. And for me, it just feels like right now, another thing that I don't have the capacity to sort through, right? And being okay with that. But I think in terms of like the other part of what I want to talk about, the other thing is like finding the support network that allows you to balance the two, right?
Yeah.
Because I don't think you have to. I live by myself, but I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that I always will. Live with a partner, that does not healing, but to me, I'm one of those people who's like, I know people, we've had some of the guests here today have been like, maybe someday that might be appropriate for me. And I'm like,
Nope.
just no. Maybe someday I'll retire into spinsterhood with my twin sister, or something like that. But roommates is probably going to be it for me. But I think that, and this is something that comes out of, I think for some folks, they think about it as relationship anarchy or political anarchism. I tend to always say that like my politics comes out of Black feminism, but it runs really parallel. Black feminism also being an anti-oppression political philosophy, so it often runs really parallel with folks who are anarchists. The particular kinds of Black feminism that I am aligned with are also anti-capitalist and queer and all of these things. So right, so that. Why was I talking about that? Sorry, this is the ADHD happening.
Well, I was going to say, like, you were talking about like how we choose those communities, how we find who we allow into the support spaces.
Yeah, because I think something that's present in both of those is like, one, the questioning of the nuclear family and the need to return to the like human connection of being in community or having support networks with folks. I do agree that there's a difference between capital C community, a support network of people who you can, or a family. I think some people use the word family when I'm talking about like chosen family and stuff like that when I say network. Family is loaded for people with the kind of traumas that I have. So I like this other term that doesn't feel as like activating, right? But that community, that support network, those pieces also are part of helping make solo polyamory work and not be as ableist as some understandings of it can be.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like as you're talking, I'm thinking about my experience through the pandemic, like the people who were in my bubble are we are all of us have chronic spoony kind of issues in one form or another. And so we get it. We understand that there are going to be days where you just may not have the capacity to do a thing. And there are going to be days where it's like, hey, I have extra capacity. Do you need some assistance? Let's help each other with grocery runs. Let's help each other with gardening and things like that. And I think choosing who that is, and that doesn't necessarily need to be a romantic partner. I have one partner in my life right now who I have, like, after some, careful deliberation, we've been together for almost 2 years now. I'm like, I am okay. I feel comfortable letting you into that place where you can be part of that practical support network. And you are also not going to be the person I call first, because I am very conscious of how easy it is for us to fall into that space of caregiver in romantic relationships. And I've experienced that caregiver burnout looking after a parent who had a chronic illness when I was a child. And, sometimes that is an inescapable reality that we have. And I'm very conscious of not wanting to get to that place in my own network. And so how do I share out those tasks? Knowing the strengths of your team. Like I feel it's like kind of like a superhero team. I have one friend who's an engineer and has done lots of carpentry work. And I'm like, I know he's the person I'm going to call when I'm like, I need to figure out how to make this thing happen. Can you give me some guidance? Like, what's the tool I need to go get? What's the thing I need to buy? And he might come over and troubleshoot with me. But, so I'm sharing that burden out and not just leaning on one person. And identifying who those people are, it takes time. I feel like it's always a work in progress.
Yeah. I think that is part of what is challenging about, particularly for folks who are transitioning to solo polyamory from maybe having a more mononormative life setup, right? Where they had the nuclear relationship kind of idea, is like how much, like, there is a time intensiveness to building the support networks and community. That is challenging because often the people that you had in your life under the other model also operate under that model for their lives, right?
Yeah.
So the amount that they are able to give to you is going to be circumscribed because they operate from the model that the vast majority of their attention and resources belong to, right, this family unit, right? And they don't have it to give for anyone else. And so sometimes what we're having to do is like discover and articulate for ourselves and to our connections, like finding people who are thinking about things a little bit differently. I mean, of course, that doesn't mean you have to drop folks. And like, I have people in my life who like have who are folks that I can depend on, but also have like absolutely no amount of like interest in solo polyamory and relationship anarchy. They probably have not heard the word mutual aid. They care about me, and they will show up for me as they can. But I know that there's not necessarily that there's limitations on that comparatively. So, but I mean, it takes time, it takes investment, finding people, determining how you trust folks, learning to trust yourself so that you can trust other people. I think that's one of the big things when you're like something where you felt like maybe over enmeshed with another person, is trusting yourself enough to know that you will be able to like pull yourself out again. But I find that dispersing, right, the expectations among people, keep it from being kind of overdraw on any one person, and also help me not to fall back into the resentment for people not being able to show up, right? If I have been thinking about how are there 2 or 3 people that I can call, then that one person that I always call who eventually is like, I can't do it today, Rosalind. I don't have to feel like, but now I have nobody. And it's your fault that I have nobody just because you said no in a way that was completely reasonable, right? That's hard. I don't say that flippantly because I've also been the person who has one person, right? And that you really feel like you could count on. And that is very painful, right? In its own way. But I think time can help with that. So.
Yeah. And I know for myself, it's been useful, especially in times when I've been feeling like I'm struggling a bit more or feeling a little more isolated, to actually just write out those lists of like people I can reach out to. Something I did last winter, because I get very, very bad seasonal affective disorder. Having grown up in the Middle East, I'm used to lots of sunshine. Now I live in the Pacific Northwest. We don't get a whole lot of sunshine, especially not in the winter. And so like I reached out to people and I'm like, hey folks, like these are the things that I know are going to help me with my self-care through the wintertime. I need to go on walks in nature. I want to go do some group trips to the local sauna. Like, here's the things. tell me what you're into doing. And then I just made those lists of people. And I still have that as like a go-to of like, I know this is who I can reach out to for these things because they've said they're into that, they're available for that. And there's also that freedom that if you're not available that day for whatever reason, you're not the only person on the list.
Yeah.
Someone's asking in the Zoom, what was that statement about releasing enmeshment? It hit and I need to write it down. Do you remember what you said?
Oh, I'm so sorry. No, that is not my talent.
This is why we're recording this.
They're released into the world. And I cannot remember what I was saying. No, I'm sorry.
So we are recording this, and you can even go check the live stream feed on YouTube. It's set up, I think, so you can like rewind a little bit. So you can probably, hopefully, go find that statement later on today.
Yeah. I know we're hitting the top of the hour. So the only other thing that I kind of wanted to say is I think something that's important to me to think about when I think about anything about solo polyamory is to think about it from a Black perspective. And when I think about Blackness and disability, I think something that's very powerful for me to talk about is that so many of us come from, and will be true for other marginalized groups as well, but we come from these communities who, because of the nature of the oppression that we have lived through, whether it's like the experience of being refugees, right, or the experience of chattel slavery or whatever it might be, but for Blackness in particular, racialized anti-Blackness, right, that experience of can really shape how our families relate to the concept of disability because it's so common for ableism to be used to prop up anti-Blackness. Like there's something wrong with us, right? Like in the past, they used to have like a mental health disorder called drapetomania, which was like the madness of Black people actually wanting to be free. That had to be a form of insanity because, you know, it was so much better, the life that you could live as an enslaved person. So there was an actual, in the United States, there was an actual illness, a diagnosis, right, for the condition of wanting to be a free person, right? The ways in which, like, the systems use disability in order to make sense of and justify these other forms of oppression then mean that when we are dealing with disabilities that do impact us in the everyday, it can be really hard for our communities to accept and acknowledge that, because there's this constant fear that, no, this is just another thing that's being told to us for our own subjugation, right? Yeah. And it can mean a really complicated relationship, right, with developing any kind of identity that allows us to understand our access needs as like real and worth doing something with. And I think one of the things that solo polyamory did for me is this kind of permission giving, along with Black feminism, right? This rejection of as well, right? But like this permission giving around loving myself deeply enough to ask questions about what I really need, who am I really, like, what is my actual personal embodied experience, and what is that telling me, separate from all of the messages I get in the world about how I should be or what I should be experiencing or what I should be thinking, right? So like asking those questions, right, can lead us to understanding our access needs in a different kind of way, and then help us to be able to ask for the support and help that we need. It's one of the ways that I think solo polyamory really shifts my understanding of my disability, because I think there's plenty of us who, you know, if we live a really enmeshed life, whether that be with romantic partners or with family, right, because of community, because we come from like collectivist cultures or whatever, there's so much that we don't ever explore or question or look into because it would have negative impacts on the larger systems that we're embedded in. And one of the things that those of us who do come from collectivist cultures have to constantly, again, balance against, right? And I know you know about this, Mel, is like that initial pushing away in solo polyamory to be able to create autonomy and independence, but remembering that like there was something of value there, right?
Yeah.
Like and so wanting to also think about like, okay, I need to push away so that I can learn about myself, and I don't have to keep compromising myself for the group, but I don't want to do that to the extremes that Western civilization asks me to do that either. And I think that somewhere in the midst of all of that is also an ability to kind of know yourself deeply around your actions as well, and seek support and help for it. But it all just winds up getting pretty funky and complicated. And I think it's one of the reasons why, like you said, there's something about being able to connect in community with other disabled people, with similar statuses and like identities as you, to figure out how they're doing this thing called life and making sense of it, because it can be a thing that you can't talk about in other spaces because it disrupts people's belief in their like okayness. Like talking about, I mean, one of the things that'll scare people the most is if you just talk about the ways in which you're sick, that you're never going to get better. It freaks them out, right? Because they could get sick in a way that they could never get better. They need you to be able to be fixable, right? And so being able to connect with people who kind of understand this experience is important, but it's complicated because oppression.
And I think no, this is great because I think it touches on, there's an internalized piece of white supremacy culture, which is perfectionism. And I think in non-monogamy, we really have to confront those narratives around perfectionism. And that comes up in so many ways when we expect perfect behavior of our partners, when we expect perfection in other people. And I think disability is seen as being in opposition to perfection. And Chani has posted a couple of things in the chat here on Zoom. It hasn't been okay, in quotation marks, for Black people to be disabled for a very long time. So even saying that we are quote unquote disabled has stigma associated with it. And I mean, I don't have a lived experience of being Black, but I know that from my experience of being a mixed race and you know, third culture kid, like there's stigma. You're facing so many forms of stigma. There can be this internalized pressure of like, I have to be as perfect as I possibly can because my disability could be used against me as an additional piece of weaponization against me in a white supremacy paradigm. And I see some resonance here as well. Chani said, loving myself deeply enough to ask questions is a word. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Roz. I appreciate the heck out of you. You are such a rock star. The Solo Polyamory group would not be the same if it wasn't for your presence as part of the Mod Squad team. Thank you. Thank you for being here today. And if you want to just pop again into the chat where people can find your work, that is awesome. So we are gonna, I know some folks have had to pop off because of time differences and stuff. We're gonna head into some breakout rooms here again in a moment. And I think most people here probably were here last time I did the poll, but I'm just gonna put the poll up again. Just to collect a little bit more data about folks who are here today. So how long have you been participating in non-monogamy? I know for a few people here, 10 to 15 years, or sorry, in solo polyamory specifically. A lot of people in that 2 to 5 year category, and some people who are brand new. And then looking at the topics that are really important to people, it's pretty evenly spread. Navigating couples privilege as a solo poly person, self-partnership, how to meet other SOPOs, navigating our mental health care. Those are all important things. So in my ideal world, I was hoping that these polls would help us create the breakout rooms, but it didn't work out that way. So we are going to have another opportunity to go into breakout rooms here for a little bit of social conversation and communication, connection time. And then when we come back in 20 minutes, I'm going to be joined by Jada from Jada Kissed on Instagram. And then Jess DeVry, Beloved Coaching, is going to be helping me to wrap up the afternoon. And I might have a little extra special guest for our last half hour. So I'm going to stop the live stream. If you've been following on the live stream, it'll be a separate live stream for the last section, and we'll see you again in half